I would like to start with an experiment. I will tell you a very bad joke, and I will see if you laugh at the joke. If so, it means you have mirror neurons. If no, it's not the case. And the joke is like that. There is an old lady. Thank you. I had no idea that mirror neurons fire so quickly. There is an old lady visiting a museum of modern art, and she looks at an object and asks an attendant standing nearby, "Young man, I assume that this hideous representation is what you call an object of modern art." And he replies, "No, madam. Actually, this one is called a mirror." And the first question I have for you, how a neuroscientist would evaluate the state of the mind of the old lady? Is this a problem with mirror neurons, or maybe just the lack of modesty that she could not recognize herself in the mirror? Okay. Anyone?
I won't spoil the joke.
Okay, so maybe seriously. The mirror neuron hypothesis claims that within our brains there are certain kinds of neurons which fire both when we execute certain action and when we observe it. So this constitutes a certain link between action and perception. And Michael, you in many of your publications, you suggested that this is something which facilitates action understanding. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Well, I think the important point I want you to remember from one of the slides was that many parts of the brain are involved when we act, many parts of the brain are involved when we observe, and there is overlap. These are the mirror neurons, but the mirror neurons are only one part of the brain circuitry in each case, point one. Point two, monkeys have mirror neurons, but as we saw from the movie, monkeys do not imitate, monkeys do not have language. So that in some sense, rather than mirror neurons themselves being the secret of our humanity, I think the secret is how our brains, through evolution, reorganize themselves to make fuller and fuller use of mirror neurons in increasingly complex ways that allowed us to master imitation in a way that other animals could not, to gain culture in a way that other animals could not, to gain language as a new way of social interaction that other animals could not share.
Well, you said that, and we saw it in the movie, that mirror neurons are strictly connected to imitation. So the hypothesis says that the fact that we have mirror neurons is something which enables imitation. Do you agree with what was said during this movie, that imitation is such a beneficial strategy of social learning, that this is something that really brought about what we call culture?
Okay, let me reiterate. Monkeys have mirror neurons. Monkeys do not have imitation, they do not have culture. So therefore, the mirror system hypothesis for me is not the hypothesis that says mirror neurons in themselves are the secret. The mirror system hypothesis for me is the evolutionary pathway that enriches the original mirror system for grasping, for emotion, to make the simple type of imitation, in the movie it was called emulation, possible, of recognizing goals and trying to achieve those goals in the way an ape can. And then further evolution that said, don't just look at the goal, pay more and more attention to the details. This required better working memory to remember more of what the others had done, even to be able to say, well, I just tried it, I didn't get it right. Let me remember what I did, let me remember what he did. That's the difference. And so to improve my performance. So it's this complex of structures that evolve to make use of the mirror neurons in new ways that is the secret of cultural evolution. And so they could not have been there without the mirror neurons at the core, but the core by itself cannot achieve all these special characteristics of human ability.
Yeah. Actually, maybe it's a question for you, Michael. That you know, another thing I want to throw here is the autistic people. So, for example, that generally autistic children, they don't imitate. So that's actually one of the ways you can tell if a child is going to be autistic. They don't they don't imitate facial expressions of the parents or whatever. And there is like one hypothesis by this famous neurologist. Autistic, yeah, autistic. So one of the hypotheses by a famous neurologist Ramachandran is that they lack mirror system, you know, and he actually made a big fuss about it, that they lack mirror system, so they don't imitate, and that's why they don't acquire language skills and things like that. However, people actually have done a lot of experiments to show that they actually can imitate. They imitate robots. So if you have an autistic child interact with a robot, they engage with it and they imitate it just like the normal child imitate their parent. And now the one hypothesis is that they do it because robots tend to make motions in a very same fashion all the time, and humans have a lot of variability, and it confuses the autistic child, because if I raise my hand, I don't raise it exactly the same way every time, and but robot will do it exactly the same way, and they engage with it, they imitate them. Anyway, I'm just throwing that one point with you because so here is I don't know exactly how these experiments have been done or how they have measured how much mirror system they have or they don't have. But this is an example of imitation that imitating machines perhaps, but not imitating humans. And I don't know, I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if you want to make a comment on that, if you know about it.
Yeah, there's a particular study by a group at UCLA in Los Angeles where they had both normal children and autistic children imitate people's facial expressions. And while they were doing this, they had imaging of their brains, and they identified what they called a mirror system in the brain for emotion. And they said that the more autistic the child, the less activity this child would exhibit in its mirror system. So there was a negative correlation between mirror system activity and autistic intensity. But the strange thing was that and this ties into the robots, in fact, the performance was the same. The autistic children imitated the facial expressions just as well as the normal children. And so the hypothesis goes like this. As an empathetic human being, if you see somebody under normal circumstances smile, it elicits a smile. If you see somebody who's looking sad, it may elicit a sad expression from you. And the idea is that this is not imitating a facial expression, it is rather that you elicit this feeling and then you express the feeling. So you're linking your perception of the action and your production of the action. Whereas the autistic child, it's more like imitating a robot. You move your mouth, you move your eyes in a particular way, but it doesn't go through this emotion recognition complex. So that is suggested to be the difference. The autistic child cannot connect it to its own social repertoire in a way that allows it to better interact with other people. It is simply a motor performance without that enrichment.
Well, if you allow me, I would like to come back for a while to the social benefits of imitation, of what we can call imitation sensu stricto. Because of course, in monkeys and apes, we find some examples of imitating the behavior of others. Usually it is what is called emulation, so imitating or copying only of the goal of action and not of the exact pattern of behavior. But I remember a recent study in Nature of the orangutan communities on 2 different islands, in which there transpired that there are differences between those communities in the way they deal with food, for instance. So it suggested a passing of some behavioral patterns from generation to generation. So this can be called imitation sensu stricte, copying both the goal and the way of acting. But my question is, what is the social potential of imitation? What are the fields in which we can, how imitation, how this mode of social learning contributes to social bonding, to the creation of bigger societies, to our cooperation, and so on and so on?
Well, a basic example is language. And the important thing is that imitation is not something you keep doing. It creates a skill on your part that you can then deploy in different ways. So for the child, repeating as accurately as it can some of the words you've produced in a particular context allows the child to learn the words and when to use them. And then building on that, again, this ratcheting, the child can begin to find it easy to use the words and pay attention to how the words are put together in different ways. So John hit Mary and Mary hit John convey very different meanings. So becoming sensitive to not just the individual words, but the way they're structured. But once you have that ability to deploy a set of words and a set of constructions, it no longer is socially appropriate to imitate. If you meet somebody at a bar and they say, "How are you?" and you say, "How are you?" and they say, "Would you like a beer?" and you say, "Would you like a beer?" imitation becomes socially counterproductive. So it's that interesting transition from gaining the tools that allow you to be a member of a culture and then being able to deploy those in novel ways that allows us to have rich social interactions.
Okay, so let us concentrate on language for a while. You suggest that there is this evolutionary road from gestures to the language as we know it, and you insist that the brain is language ready. It's not equipped with some inborn universal grammar, but it is ready to for the download, let's say, of language after we are born. Does it mean that the Chomskyan idea of generative grammar is something we should forget about? Or there are some aspects of this famous theory which can survive the current revolution in thinking about the evolution of language?
Okay, well, as some of you know, Noam Chomsky was and is one of the most, or probably the most influential linguist of the second half of the 20th century. But his expertise was to try and find abstract ways of understanding grammar, so that how do nouns and verbs and adjectives fit together in general patterns, rather than how do I communicate by finding the words to express meanings. Unfortunately, he was an expert on abstract grammar, but made statements about how does language develop, how does language evolve, that were totally outside his competence. But because he had been so influential in his theory of grammar, many people would accept his theories. So I will tell you one personal anecdote. I had the privilege of knowing Chomsky when I was a graduate student at MIT, and he was very good to me, and he would answer my naive questions about language once a semester. But years later, I had a PhD student about the same time as Bipin, named Jane Hill, who studied a 2-year-old girl and the way in which her language changed every week with her experience. And so Jane both did the study of this child and came up with a computational theory. very different from what Chomsky had to say about development. So I sent him a letter explaining Jane's theory, asking for his reaction. And his response was interesting. He said, well, I don't need to read it since I know it's wrong. And then he very courteously gave me a page of the truth. So that the idea was he knew by pure thought, unconstrained by data, how language develops. And I'm afraid this for me wipes out his relevance to scientific discussion as distinct from structural analysis of the abstract grammar of language.
So, yeah, of course.
I just want to add another anecdote. This is not personal, but I read it in this book. It's about Piaget. Piaget also, he believed that there was, I forget, some age after which children can imitate or something like that. And there was some PhD student, and she collected some data to show that children can imitate at a much younger age than what Piaget had according to his theory and stuff like that. And so, of course, Piaget was very well known, so she was a little bit afraid. She was a graduate student, and but she showed Piaget it was also later in Piaget's career, so he was quite senior already and well known. So she showed the data, so Piaget looked at her videos, and then his response was that, well, so I guess somebody has to come up with a better theory now.
Well,
exactly, that's why I wanted to share that anecdote.
Well, it seems that when we think about the phylogenetic and ontogenetic trajectory of the evolution of language, and if this is something which comes from gestures, which probably served maybe not only, but also coordinating action and simple forms of communication, these are very concrete forms of communicating. Now the question is, how did we arrive from those very concrete instances of communication to very abstract ways of communicating, like higher mathematics, for instance, or even, I don't know, poetry or something like that. Recently there is, I think, a very fierce discussion concerning Lacan's theory of metaphors. He also links it with the neuron hypothesis, suggesting that the concrete concepts we acquire are things which are deeply rooted in the motoric schemes of our brains, and then through the process of metaphorization we arrive at more abstract concepts. Bipin is a very good specialist in the cognitive theory of metaphors, so what's your view on this? How we acquire abstract concepts, how we acquire abstract language on the basis of concrete language?
Well, both in evolutionary terms and in a child's development, the use of gesture is very important. A child of about a year will have as much in the way of gestures as in the way of words. But by 2, the use of words in their language, whether it's a spoken or a sign language, will predominate over gesture. So we come back to that word from Tomasello in the video of ratcheting. Society has been ratcheting up, building more and more abstract concepts, so that although we start with gestures, whether as ancient humans or as little children, over millennia as a group, over a few years as a child, we are exposed to concepts which can build upon, ratchet upon the earlier concepts, so that we can make a path from placing 2 objects on the table till finally we can master Cantor's theory of different infinities. But that's not something we can create within our lifetime. It's because this whole pathway has been charted by society, or a specialized part of society that we can slowly be introduced to. And of course the challenge of education is to find paths which maintain a feeling of intuition even as we move further and further away from our original embodied experience. I'm sure Bipin has a lot to say about this.
I think I'll just say briefly that I think that if you look at how also children use concepts, initially they start using concepts. It's actually very much sort of like metaphorical in the sense that, see what happens in a metaphor is that we use a concept and then you apply it to some situation, and because there is no conventional meaning association, so you have to kind of make a guess. And it's a little bit like what Michael was doing with his gesture of waving his arms. So you try to make a guess, and sometimes you are wrong, and you adjust it a little bit. And that's what happens in metaphors, that we make a, the communication is a little bit vague, but because it's vague, it gives the reader or the listener some flexibility and sometimes creativity to interpret that in a certain way. But then over the repeated usage, then things become more solidified and they become conventional. So if you look at the words that are now a lot of words we take for granted now, they're very fixed, rigid meaning. But then initially they came up, they were used metaphorically or something like that. So there's a lot of debate about, like, some people claim that like all language is metaphorical, and some people say no, it's not, it cannot be, because in order to have a metaphorical language, you have to have a conventional language to begin with, because you cannot have metaphor without a conventional language. So there's a little controversy about it, but I think that if you go back to kind of to really get down to the origin of metaphor, you have to go down and maybe go even to the sign language, at the origin of that, and then you see that when somebody makes a sign, how do you interpret that? And through and I would claim that interpretation is essentially metaphorical, and only through repeated use, and you build this system, and then even the signs become conventionalized so that it means this, and then over, like, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of years, then you get conventional language. But but the fact that even in any conventional language there are still vibrant metaphors, you can always create new metaphors and new meanings, and that shows that there's always, this process is kind of an open-ended process. So you can create some conventional language, but it does not exhaust the whole range of possible meaning. There are always, the meaning space is almost infinite, actually. So no matter how rigid your language is, no matter how rich it is, you can always create new metaphors because the meaning space is always open.
Okay, let me give you some homework to relate to this last bit of the discussion. So the homework is to try and make explicit as possible how a whale stops being a big fish. Because to get the child from the obvious understanding that a whale is a big fish to learning that it is not, you have to introduce the concept of mammal. And to get the concept of mammal, you have to have the concept of mother and live birth and suckling, and some of these will be directly experienced by the child. Some of these will be abstractions that can be conveyed through a mixture of pictures and analogies and language. And so that's your homework. If you can understand how how our history got us to the point where we had the concept of mammal, and then how we could get a child to the point where its obvious understanding the whale as a big fish is destroyed by explaining that it is a mammal, then I think you have a very personal and detailed answer to the relationship between our immediate embodied experience and the greater and greater abstractions we can build up through the ability of language to let us exploit our social history or the understanding of our culture.
Well, I gather from this part of the discussion that maybe we should look at language in a different way than we used to. So language is not something we find in our dictionaries and grammar books. It's not an isolated system of syntactic and semantic rules, which we learn somehow and then combine and generate a potentially infinite number of sentences. Language seems rather a living organism, strictly embedded in the network of other social rules. But if so, Michael speaks of brain which is language ready, but maybe we should rather speak of brain which is culture ready. So brain is ready not only for acquiring language, but all kinds of social rules of behavior. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
And you, Bipin?
Well, I don't know. I have to say, because we work with autistic children, and we actually develop techniques for autistic children. So I'll actually tell you one, maybe a provocative statement. When was it? 2-3 months ago, I was in a meeting with the parents of autistic children, and it was this specialist school, and so we had a visitor from UK, and she also works with autistic children, so she gave a talk about it. And at some point, I was just, because all these parents, they were very troubled. They each had an autistic child. They were troubled about them. It's very difficult. I mean, we work with them. It's very difficult to take care of them and deal with them. But I made this provocative statement. I said, well, it's quite possible that in the future, maybe everybody will be autistic, or most people will be autistic. Actually, I imagine maybe you can write a novel like that imagine when most people are autistic, and so you can have to imagine a world which is designed for autistic people. So their brain is wired very differently, So these questions about assumptions about culture and language, one can question that, and they have a society like that. And in the middle of that, there's a kind of child is born who is linear thinker, language-based, needs hugs every so often and things like that. And they don't know what to do with that child. It's to them, it's an abnormal child. And it's just reversing the perspective. So all I'm saying is that I'm kind of questioning that. I think we look at the normal people there and we assume the language and culture things are very important, and so far they have, of course, played a very important role. But I'm not sure about the future, actually. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just leaving a little bit of doubt that it's possible that a new society will emerge with maybe people with different kind of, already you see the technology is doing a lot of things to our cognition, actually, a lot of things that people used to do earlier, like people now, you may have seen there was a, Banksy, the graffiti artist. There's a famous picture by him, he drew on a door. So you see this couple hugging. So if you look at it from a distance, you will look like they are a young couple hugging. But then they each have a cell phone in their hand, and they are actually texting, with an arm like that. So you see that it's, I think the technology is really changing our social structure a lot, and I'm not sure that, maybe for the better or worse, but whatever, I'm not sure what it will bring to even like in the next 30-40 years,
Okay. As I would like to give our audience a chance to pose a few questions, 3 last questions from me pertaining to the main topic of our discussion, that is the search for the soul. Marco Jacoboni, one of the people working in this team that discovered the mirror neurons in Parma, he put forward what he calls the shared manifold hypothesis. This is a very awful name, but the idea is quite interesting. He says that before we acquire the feeling of being self-conscious, before we acquire the self, there is some shared sphere between individuals, and we can only understand what does it mean to be a person, what does it mean to be someone distinct, because we interact with others. And of course the mirror system is something which is, according to Jacoboni, of course, is something which conditions the very possibility of calling oneself a person. Would you agree with that hypothesis?
Yeah, the important thing to note is that the mirror system, or this broader system I've tried to characterize, is not itself innate in the sense that the set of actions and empathy and understanding are genetically specified. What is genetically specified is having a system that can acquire the ability to recognize more and more actions, more and more emotions. So if, like the famous case of this poor child, Jeannie, who was locked in a closet from an early age, if there is no experience of human action, human emotion, human empathy, then the wiring of that system becomes useless, and then it is impossible for her to relate to others and become a genuine person. And so it's, yeah, we are each persons in our own society, and whether for good or bad, in terms of Bipin's example, our society is continually changing in terms of what we consider. He showed us how the legal definition of person in America changes. We've gone from a society where gay marriage is an abomination to one in which 60% of the public agree that this is an appropriate way in which humans can live together. So our society, in addition to ourselves, are changing. Our self is defined with respect to our society is changed with respect to ourselves, and neither is immutable.
But could we say that the mind or the soul is a human mind, a human soul is something which would not exist without the constant interactions with others? Now, this is a philosophical question, of course. There are many examples of feral children raised by wild animals, and they, when found somewhere, they behaved in a completely non-human way. So a more philosophical question would be, would our minds, would our souls exist without the others, the other people around us?
Well, let me take a more specific debate. Noam Chomsky, whom I spoke of earlier, argues that language evolved to support thought. And his argument for this is rather superficial. He says that when I am thinking, I continually have words come into my head. Now, firstly, if the words that come into his head are English, as I believe they are, they would not be there unless he had developed as a member of an English-speaking culture. And secondly, why is he bothering to tell us about it if he doesn't think language is for communication? So again, it's one of these loops that as language develops, we have more things we can talk about. This allows us to think more deeply. This allows us to contribute to the ongoing conversation. So I don't think you can break the loop either way. If we are not engaged selves, then society will not exist. But if there is no society, there is nothing for the self to engage with, whether it's a small tribal grouping or a larger nation.
Well, so let me finish with a provocative question. Or maybe Bipin wants to add something, sorry.
What's the question?
The question concerned, okay, the question was, can we speak of a human mind or human soul if there is, yeah.
Okay. Actually, I don't know. I think of it as a, think about it, I'll just again take the other view. Think about, take for instance a tennis player. When you are serving, they are thinking, but I'm not sure they are thinking in language actually. They are thinking what action to take, how to, and many times the players cannot verbalize their thought. Actually, if they start to verbalize their thought, it confuses them. They can't replay, you know. And I think that even when a person is alone or an individual is alone, they have to do problem solving, like maybe they need food or they have to figure out where to hunt or whatever. And there's no society, and I think they have thoughts. I would like to say they have thoughts, and there's nothing to communicate, you know. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky situation because, of course, you look at many, you know, of course, you know, we are social animals, so this situation is kind of rather rare. You, of course, have examples of people get stranded alone for sometimes many years, or you can look at this guy, the Papillon, you know, the one who was in the solitary confinement for a long time. But the thing is that when people are put in a situation like that, they already have acquired the skills from being in the society, language and other skills. So it's a hypothetical thing that if really an individual were alone from the birth, you know, and just doing problem solving and somehow figuring out how to survive or things like that, what kind of cognition they will have, I don't know, you know. But I mean, if I accept that as a like thought experiment that it's possible, then I think it provides a little different view to the idea that culture and language is necessary. Okay? So I'll take this position, but with a grain of salt that I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you very much. And we still have time for a few questions from the audience. Okay, maybe.
Hello, I've got a question for our guest from Australia. Have you got any thoughts about theory of memes established by Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackmore?
Okay, so the question is theory of memes. So, for example, Justin Bieber is a meme, right? I mean, I think this is similar in some way to this notion of a social schema that Mary Hesse and I talked about, but there we're trying to look at the larger social system, whereas a meme tends to be a much smaller grain object. So I think it's probably just pointing to the fact that it's more like a word or a phrase or a little thought that propagates through a community and then may last or may die out. But I think it's very much consistent with the point I was making, that in some sense we create social reality between us, but then that social reality comes back and shapes us. So that dynamic loop between the self and the society, memes, I think, are a reasonable description of part of that process.
Any further questions?
I have a question about artificial intelligence. If it is possible, if our brains are so complex and sophisticated, if deterministic machines, like Turing machines, could perform any form of intelligence.
So you're asking whether artificial intelligence will produce fake humans?
I think that if we are so complicated person, if it is possible that from zeros and ones we could produce any higher form of organization like intelligence.
Well, there are two different answers. We've seen, for example, with Siri and Watson and so on, that different functions of the human can be reproduced. We see that with Google, knowledge can be made available in a way that takes us beyond what books made available. So I think in terms of if we define a specific enough function, we can implement it with more and more sophistication in a way that we then as humans can either benefit from or not. But this is different from building something that can stand in for a human, in the sense that I think that unless you have a human body can interact on equal terms with other humans, then the whole development of your cognition will be different. Now, if you want the counterexample, there was the recent movie Her, in which a simulated artificial intelligence was such that a young man was able to fall in love with her and then became very depressed when he found that she thought so quickly that 1,000 other people were in love with her at the same time. But in terms of my own view, I don't think our progress of artificial intelligence is to build more humans. We have 7 billion and counting. We don't need more of those. It will be rather to find ways in which people can come to believe that they can be augmented by having robots, artificial intelligences, search engines in their environment, which will be designed to interact in normal ways. Now, in fact, Bipin teaches courses on this subject here in Kraków, so perhaps you can distill some of that.
I'll give you maybe a bolder answer than that. So first of all, I think it's hard to hear here, but if I heard you correctly, you were asking that if zeros and ones can, a machine working with zeros and ones can emulate or simulate a human being. Is that correct, or? Okay, so I'll just say that, well, if you look at that, I mean, I would say that you are also working with zeros and ones, because if I reduce down to your brain functioning at some level, I can also characterize it as zeros and ones. So I think that's not a good way to put it like that, or maybe not zeros and ones, but to some simple mechanisms, to say that your brain is also working on some very, at the bottom of it, there are some very basic principles. Also, if you look at how the technology has come has become nowadays, actually, first of all, you don't have to model the brain as it is. Some people are modeling it, but we can actually learn a lot of things about it just by observing the behavior. And I think that nowadays, because there's so much data that people generate through their actions and through the machine learning techniques, there's a whole lot of things about people's behavior that people can predict. Actually, I say that, you get these ads from when you buy things in Amazon.com or whatever, and then you get ads. And I don't know if you keep track of them. 10 years ago, you used to get books suggested or some product that if you bought this, you'll like this and things like that. And see, they are getting more and more accurate because they are getting more data about you, more data about other people. And I say that the ultimate thing, which may or may not happen, is that they will only show you the things that you will buy. I'm not saying that you want to buy, you will buy. And then you say, well, how can they be sure? Because there are a lot of things, I'm very complicated. Yes, of course, but this is all learned because it's from the past behavior. We have so much data that we can completely predict you, that we know when you'll have money and when you're going to buy things. It's a kind of maybe a dream that, not a dream, a thing that may not come to be, but we are really getting, I would say, quite close. I was telling Michael this, you may know that there was this actual case last year that there was some teenage woman, and she found out herself that she was pregnant, and also her family found out that she was pregnant because she started to get the mailing about some baby-related products and things like that, and that just happened because she used to buy, I forget, maybe it was some Target or some chain like that. So they use these programs that monitor that if people buy X kind of products, they are more likely to buy Y kind of products. So based on her, basically her shopping pattern, I could say, that the program decided that she was pregnant. Of course, program had no concept of pregnant. The program just realized that, well, she has bought these things, so she's going to buy these things. And those are baby-related products. But see, this kind of technology, and I can just go, there are a lot of other kind of, if you look at the current the way the things are happening also with like Google Glasses and all kinds of new devices are coming up, I think in a way it's scary actually that where we are headed towards, and I don't know, as I said, for better or worse, but I think that we are going very close, we are going to get very close to the kind of artificial beings that are you know, that maybe they know us much too well, and they can do things that are, you know, sort of exceeds our expectations or things like that.
Okay, I think it's time for me to ask you a question. Are we ready for dinner? I am. So thank you very much.